Hello. It's always surprising when the screen starts recording. So yes, here I am again. This is the first of the lectures on the family photo. I think there might be two or three of them, 15 minutes each, as I had said. So what I want to do first is address what we might consider the history of the family photo, right? For a genre to exist, it is it's practically mandatory for it to be sedimented in history, right? That it has developed from somewhere, from something that provides it with its roots, right? So I want us to consider the roots of the family photo. Of course, the most obvious roots are in paintings and in sculptures, but the family photo distinguishes itself from paintings in that we hardly see paintings in, say, specifically in Western art, right, where there's a family and they're all smiling or sitting around a fire or something. That is not the normative family painting. Family portraits are usually reserved or were reserved for the aristocratic members of society, royalty, perhaps, the landed classes, the elite and the wealthy, right? Family photos are not that limited in their circulation and in their consumption. There are people of all ranks and classes and rungs of society that participate in the genre that is the family photo. So it's an interesting discrepancy. And of course it has to do with the fact of patronage, right? You needed to pay a painter, hire a painter, and the painter, being an artist, was expensive, right? And the more renowned the painter, the greater the fee. So if you could afford a painter like, say, Vermeer, right, to paint your portrait, to paint your family's portrait, if you could afford someone like Velázquez, and we'll talk about Velázquez and his painting, which I'll bring up next week, perhaps, when we're in class. But these were renowned painters and artists, and it cost a pretty penny for a family or a person to hire the painter, contract them to, say, painting the family. So when such a moment took place, it was austere, it was ritualistic, it was ceremonial, it was not a la quote unquote natural, right? This is a very important distinction between, say, a family portrait in a painting scenario or a sculpture scenario, even more rare than a painting is a family sculpture. So distinguishing those on the one hand from the family photo, which, as many of you have commented on, is a natural genre. And I put natural in scare quotes and air quotes because I would like us to return to that idea. What exactly is natural, right, about the family photo, and how exactly do we arrive at that naturalness? Is there something like being too natural? And I think my examples that I posted on our Facebook page and on Moodle are in some ways responses that are inviting you to question the naturalness of a family photo. Is there something as being uncomfortably natural, right? So the root of the family photo in a family portrait in painting completely distanced itself from that naturalness. Of course, there was a sense that these images in the painting must look like the real thing, the real people, but those real people were very obviously posing, right? They wore their finest clothing. They wore their regalia, if you will, right? They looked their best, and very seldom did they smile, right? So this idea of smiling for the camera, right? Say cheese. The artist did not ask for that when mostly he, sometimes she, they were painting, right? And this is in part because these were individuals who were literally modeling for the painter. They were standing in front of the painter would cast them in some sort of a draft. And those of you that are art mages could probably talk much more intellectually about this than I am, but the idea was the first draft was a sort of literal impression that the artist got from the people he was painting, or they were painting, she was painting. And that took a while, right? Quite realistically, they would stand for hours on end. In fact, there are very famous portraits of very famous people who complained about the fact that the artist is taking too long, right? Kings have complained about the fact that, the artist is making them stand around in a seemingly uncomfortable position, because they obviously don't want to slump and slouch. They wanted to stand and look very proper, and that was not necessarily their comfortable, natural gait or a posture, right? So with that, if the painter asked them to smile, right, to look welcoming or something like that, that would have been way too uncomfortable. A smile could not have been held for that long. And of course, the smile, if you think about it, and again, this is important in the context of close reading, the smile simply, it would have been simple if the smile only isolatedly worked with the mouth and the teeth, right? But instead, it affects the entire face, sometimes the entire body, right? So that makes the smile much more difficult to duplicate in painting. So asking a person to hold a posture and a smile for several hours over a course of several days perhaps would have been impossible, which is the reason that in classical paintings of families and family portraits, we don't see the family members smiling. Interestingly, the earliest photographs kind of duplicated the refusal of the smile. Not necessarily because of the same reasons, but kind of. So the exposure time that the earliest photographs took was much, much, much more than what it requires today in, especially in digital world, when you can take your phone and make it into a camera, a very good camera even, right? So the earliest photographs, and again, if you're interested in photography, I would encourage you to take classes in art history with Dr. Elizabeth Howie, who is a scholar of photography. And if you're interested in the practice of photography, definitely take classes with the photography professors in visual arts, right? So specifically with Professor Easton Selby, who is the chair of visual arts, who is also a fantastic photographer and a professor of photography. So these would be ways in which you can understand photography more viscerally and intimately and fully. But think about the history of photography and think about the first photographs that are available to us in history. That's at the turn of the century, right? At the very beginning of the 20th century, we can look at the daguerreotype, the crossing over periods of the 19th and 20th centuries. But those are photographs in which people did not smile because it, again, took too long for the photograph to develop, for the photograph, for the exposure, right, to complete the picture. And it would have been, so the person would have had to stay still for a much longer time than it is the case today. And because of that, people didn't smile. It would have been just too physically difficult and painful for them to be like for a long time, right? So the pictures, and I'll post some examples of this after I've posted all the lectures, so you can see the examples of what I mean. The images of the people in these portraits was almost uncanny and almost frightening. They did not look homely, for example. They did not look comfortable. They even looked dead. Which brings me to another aspect of the history of the photograph, of the family photograph, right? While most of you posted images from happy occasions, right, of you with members of your family and close family specifically, in festivity mode, either a birthday or a holiday or a vacation or a milestone of some or another sort. Most of you did that. The earliest photographs were not commemorating happy occasions. If anything, they were commemorating rather tragic occasions. So there are photographs of the dead, right, that are very disturbingly, from our perspective, modeled alongside the living. So parents with their dead infant, children with a dead mother. These were still photographs in the literal and kind of poetic sense of the term. And these were memento mori, right? These were memorials that were offered by the family and to the family, right? People who could afford to have a photographer memorialize their dead child would take a photograph with the dead child, right? And the dead child would be dressed up and not in a coffin. The dead child would be held right next to the parents and kept right there, presented in the photograph. And because of the early stages of photography, there was very little difference that we could tell between the living and the dead, because the living people were standing still, almost dead-like, right? Because they did not want to blink, they did not want to smile, and they just stood there like effigies for the longest time that it took for the photograph to be clicked, if you will. And of course, it was technically, tragically easier for the dead body to appear still because it was still, right? So the early photographs of the family were almost the opposite of what, well, quite the opposite actually, of what the vast majority of you posted as examples of the genre of family photograph. What you did is absolutely right. This is where we are today in the genre that is the family photograph. We don't post pictures of family members crying, right? We definitely don't post, I would think it would be rude and inappropriate to take pictures of the dead body standing or made to stand next to members of the living family, right? What has happened in the meanwhile? What has happened from that stage in the history of the family to the current moment that we inhabit in the history of the family? And how is the photograph archiving these changes, right? That's something which I would like us to consider. And in the next lecture, I would like us to think about this particular transformation. What has led to it? Is it a healthy transformation? Where are we going next? And we'll talk about naturalness as well. All right, so I'm going to close shop now. I will see you in just a little bit in the next lecture.